Hi everyone. Today you're looking at the first of two sets of lecture slides for the module based on the family subsystem that includes siblings. So in this particular lecture, we're going to be defining the sibling relationship and talking about factors that influence what the sibling relationship looks like. In the second set of lecture slides, we'll be looking at the sibling relationship across the lifespan. So let's get started. Okay, so before we look closely at different types of siblings, I wanted to just point out a couple of features of sibling relationships that I think are really important and worth spending a little bit of time thinking about. The first thing is that siblings, for many of us, are the longest relationship that we have throughout our entire life. And really think about that, it makes sense. Parents might, obviously be there for a large portion of our life, but may not be there as long as siblings. Friends may come and go, other relatives, the same thing, but potentially siblings are the longest relationship you may have. So that's certainly an important feature of the sibling relationship. Another thing that I think is important to point out is that many of us, or really most of us, have a sibling. In Western countries, more than 80% of individuals have a sibling. So certainly being an only child, if you are an only child, right, you're in the minority. Along with that, I would also just point out that in general, especially when we are growing up, we tend to spend a lot of time with our siblings. Often we spend more time with our siblings than anyone else. We're with our sibling really more than our parents, more than our friends, or other relatives. So for all of these reasons, I think the sibling relationship is a unique relationship and certainly a really interesting relationship to look at a little bit more closely. There are a wide variety of sibling relationships, of course. Full siblings are siblings that share the same parents. Half siblings share one parent. Step siblings do not share parents, but their parents they don't have the same biological parents, but they're related because their parents are married. And then of course we have adoptive siblings. And I've also added the idea of fictive siblings. We've talked about the term fictive kin in this class already, and we know that that just really is referring to individuals that are not related to us legally or biologically, but that we self-define as family. And so fictive siblings are those individuals that are really not technically your siblings, at least not according to the law or according to genetics, but they may be individuals that feel like siblings to you and that you define and that you label as a sibling. The sibling relationship provides a lot of functions, right? Or in other words, it serves a lot of purposes. We get a lot out of our siblings and having interactions with our siblings. A lot of positive things come from sibling relationships. Of course, maybe some not always positive, right? But you can look at this list and you can see a variety of the purposes of the sibling relationship. The first item I have on the list is that siblings can provide care. They can provide support. And they can really be kind of a nurturing individual in our lives. Along with that, I think one thing that's kind of important to point out is that siblings really can teach us pro-social behaviors, right? They can teach us positive behaviors about how to interact with each other. Now, this doesn't mean that always has to happen in a really positive way. Sometimes it does, right? Sometimes if we are kind to our sibling and then they appreciate that and so they are kind back to us, or in some way we kind of get positive incentive for our kindness, then we learn that that's important and we continue to do that. Of course, in other ways, maybe we are in conflict with our sibling or we hit our sibling or something like that, and they teach us that that is not okay, right? And there's some kind of consequence. I watch, I think I've shared with you, I have a son and a daughter who are a couple years apart, and I watch them interact, and they are not always kind to each other, certainly, but I think they really learn a lot about how to interact with other people based on interaction with each other, right? It's really kind of a safe place to, I guess, I don't know, try things out and learn about how to be kind, how to not be kind, I don't know, how to be humorous, how to share, how to not share. and just some of the outcomes associated with all those kind of things. I've heard some people refer to the sibling relationship as kind of a training ground for social skills. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. I think it's really kind of interesting to think of your sibling as someone who really does just kind of teach you about social skills and provides this learning experience for these pro-social behaviors. Our siblings can be an attachment figure for us. If you remember earlier in the semester, we learned a lot about attachment theory and the importance of individuals forming attachments to their caregivers. Really only about 8% of siblings report a sibling as a primary attachment figure, but about 2/3 of individuals report an attachment to a sibling. So certainly siblings can provide an attachment figure. Siblings can really help us with our perspective taking skills. In other words, siblings help us to try to imagine what it's like to be in another person's shoes. We know perspective taking is just really a foundational and crucial skill for a wide variety of other types of communication behaviors, like being able to have and express empathy, being able to provide social support and comforting and advice, and so on and so on. So the fact that our siblings can help us take another's perspective is a really important skill. I sometimes share a story about this one just because I think it was a really important moment in my relationship with my sisters. I think I've mentioned before that I have a twin sister, and that she and I were pretty competitive growing up. And there was really kind of a lot of sibling rivalry, really. I know I've mentioned that my parents are both only children, so I remember a lot of times my mom saying, "Oh, why can't you guys just get along? I would do anything if I had a sister. Come on, guys, just get along." So anyway, growing up, my sister and I were pretty competitive. I remember one time in particular when I was in my sister's room and I happened to notice her diary. And it was probably like early middle school, I think. So I see her diary and it's just kind of open on her bed. And I'll give you a minute here to think about what I did. Of course, I opened it, right? In hindsight, I feel kind of bad about that, but I opened it and I read through it. At the time, I couldn't resist. Well, I'll tell you, when I read through it, what she had to say about me was not particularly kind. She did not exactly like me, which wasn't surprising. Like I said, we kind of fought a lot. But as I read through the journal, what I was reading were things that basically said that I just didn't really take the time to kind of understand her and understand where she was coming from, and that I tended to get a little bit better grades than her, tended to be a little bit more athletic when we were younger, and that I had a tendency to rub that in her face. And so in other words, I really just was really not seeing the world from her point of view, and certainly was lacking in my perspective taking ability. And once I read that, and really, it hit me hard, and kind of I thought about it, it really changed the way I interacted and kind of the way I thought about my relationship with my sister. So I'm not necessarily saying that you have to read your sibling's diary in order to engage in perspective taking. I'm certainly not encouraging you to do that. But absolutely, siblings can help us with perspective taking skills. Okay, moving on, we know that siblings help us with socialization, right? Through interacting with our siblings, we learn about social norms, our family norms. We learn about values and manners and rules and all of those different types of things. No doubt, our siblings can help us with conflict resolution. As we already mentioned, a sibling relationship tends to be fraught with conflict. Usually they are not real significant conflicts, but they tend to be pretty frequent. I think it's funny sometimes when you think about conflict in a sibling relationship, often we just refer to that as sibling rivalry, and that's just how brothers are, or that's just how sisters are. But when you really think about some of the things that you may do to or with your sibling and vice versa, if you did that to another person, we wouldn't just chalk it up to, person rivalry or what have you, right? We would say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you're doing that to that person." But something about siblings, if you just kind of chuck it up to sibling rivalry. So not that that's a good thing, but certainly kind of something to think about. So absolutely, there's plenty of opportunity to learn about conflict and to hopefully develop strategies for effectively dealing with conflict with your sibling. Finally, siblings do offer us the opportunity to engage in competition. One study that I think was really interesting that looked at how siblings engage in competition examined siblings participating in a race. And so what they found was, interestingly enough, it's kind of contrary to expectations, how well the siblings dealt with situations of competition and comparison was really more related to the quality of the relationship than to the actual performance. So it turns out how you felt about the competition, whether you were really upset about losing, or maybe it didn't really bother you that much, how you felt about the competition was really less related to how the competition went. Like you got beat in that race by 5 minutes or by only 15 seconds. And instead, how you felt about the competition was much more related to the quality of the relationship. So at first, I do think that that's kind of surprising finding, but then when you think about that a little bit more, I think it does kind of make sense. Okay, so certainly our siblings provide a variety of functions. They serve a lot of purposes. Now, with that being said, I just want to kind of quickly mention, and your book talks about this a little bit more, the fact that only siblings do not necessarily show less competent communication skills. So if you do not have siblings, it does not mean that you do not develop these same types of skills that were mentioned in this slide, right? Some studies have found that only children may be more likely to be victims of aggressive behavior or maybe kind of picked on. But as only children develop, they do not, on average, show differences in communication skills than people with siblings. Probably the answer to that is because there's a lot of different people, there's a lot of different relationships that can serve the functions that are mentioned on this slide, right? It doesn't just have to be performed by a sibling. It could be cousins or neighbors or friends or what have you. All right, so before we move on, I would just ask you to think about a question here. So we know sibling relationships can look like a lot of different types. Some siblings might be really, really close. Some siblings might be really, really contentious and full of arguments. Some siblings might just be kind of apathetic, or there might just simply be some kind of lack of intimacy or closeness to each other. There are a variety of ways that siblings may interact in different ways as the sibling relationship looks. So my question to you is why? What factors influence the sibling relationship and how siblings interact? I encourage you to think about this a little bit. Maybe hit pause and think about this. Maybe go to your textbook and or think back to the reading that you've already done and think about some answers to this. And then on the next slide here, we'll take a look at some possibilities. Okay, so let's see, what factors influence the nature of the sibling relationship? I've got a list here of a lot of possibilities, and maybe some of these that are ones that you came up with. The list, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but it does identify some of the various factors that have really received some attention regarding being important in influencing what the sibling relationship looks like. So the first example there is birth spacing. What birth spacing is talking about is how far apart siblings are. So are there 2 years between you and your older sibling, or are there 10 years between you and your sibling? One of the terms that I think is kind of important to think about when you're talking about birth spacing is the idea of reciprocal siblings versus complementary siblings. So hopefully you noticed those terms when you were doing the reading. Reciprocal siblings, of course, are siblings that have kind of an equal or egalitarian relationship. The siblings tend to be like peers or friends. So this type of relationship usually occurs when siblings are pretty close in spacing, so they're only a few years apart. On the other hand, complementary siblings are siblings that are more like a parent-child or teacher-student relationship. The older sibling tends to take on some responsibility of teaching or providing guidance to the younger sibling. Basically, the siblings are at different developmental stages, so that's why they kind of have this type of relationship. Of course, this type of relationship is more likely when there's a larger amount of space or there are more years between the siblings. Another important factor that can influence the nature of the sibling relationship is birth order. When we're talking about birth order, of course, we're talking about, are you the firstborn or the secondborn? Are you a middle child? Are you the youngest, right? To be perfectly honest, although a lot of people have studied birth order, and there are just some interesting things out there regarding stereotypical traits of firstborn children versus middle children or youngest. The reality is that most of this research does not provide any kind of consistent results and typically is kind of flawed methodologically. So I think we have to be kind of cautious about that. But when we are looking at birth order, one thing that I think is important for you that I want you to kind of think about is this concept of de-identification, which again, hopefully may have stood out to you from your reading. De-identification is the idea that often the secondborn or younger children attempt to create an identity that is unique or different from the older children. So, for example, maybe you had an older sibling that was known as like a star athlete and a real jock, and they were, winning all kinds of awards when they were growing up, when they were on the basketball team. And so you are, kind of thinking about what kind of hobbies you enjoy, and you tell yourself, no way am I going to be on the basketball team. I don't want to have to just follow in my older siblings' footsteps. I want to do something different. I don't want everybody to just continually call me, well, you're John's little brother. So you decide that you are going to pick up a musical instrument and that you are going to kind of pursue a path of playing music. Okay. So, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes younger siblings learn from older siblings and follow with similar ideas and hobbies and interests. But the concept of de-identification is used to describe when younger siblings try to create their own unique and separate identity. Okay, sex of siblings, how does that affect the sibling relationship? Generally speaking, compared to males, females report greater intimacy, admiration, and affection in their sibling relationship. So sister or female sibling dyads tend to use just a lot more relationship maintenance behaviors. They tend to kind of offer and accept a lot more advice from each other. They tend to engage in a lot more self-disclosure with each other. So generally speaking, the data indicates that sister dyads tend to be the closest and most intimate of the sibling relationships. Number of siblings can influence sibling relationships. One thing that I think is kind of interesting about this one is the, I guess, kind of voluntary nature of interaction that comes with having multiple siblings. If there are only 2 siblings in a family, then if you are trying to, let's say, plan a surprise anniversary party for your parents, then it's really just you and your other sibling that might get together to work on that, and you kind of have to interact with that sibling. On the other hand, if there's a number of siblings, then you may choose or you may prefer to interact with one sibling versus another sibling. And of course, that can kind of play out, and that might be true just with everyday interaction as well. When there's only one other sibling or 1 or 2 other siblings, then the interaction can be a little bit less voluntary. Whereas if there are multiple siblings involved, then there might be more choice in who you choose to interact with. So you can imagine that there might be some interesting kind of implications for this idea of kind of the voluntary nature of the sibling relationship. The last 2 factors that I have listed on this list include differential parental treatment and communication and other familial relationships. And I have an asterisk by each one of those because these two are factors that are best supported by research. So all the other factors are kind of interesting, and probably anecdotally or personally, you might be able to relate to how these factors might influence your own sibling relationship. But when it comes to like consistent findings, the other factors are kind of all over the board, right? I mean, although in general, sister-sister relationships are the closest, of course, sometimes, brothers are closer than sisters. Or, often firstborn children are the leaders and on average have higher IQs and so on, but not always, right? So there's a little bit of lack of consistency with the other factors. But when it comes to differential parental treatment and communication and other familial relationships, those two factors tend to be really consistently correlated with the sibling relationship. Now, oops, sorry. Well, let me go ahead and say I have one more thing I wanted to say here about that. Now, children tend to report about 2/3 of cases of preferential treatment as fair and tolerable. And it might be for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, right? Children can appreciate the fact that siblings may just simply have different needs at different times. So it's okay that, Sarah got a new pair of tennis shoes and I didn't. Her feet were growing and mine weren't. So I understand that. Maybe next time, when I need tennis shoes, I'll get them and she won't. Okay, great. So a lot of times children can understand the difference in parental treatment and can report it as feeling still fair. What's interesting about that, though, is that children tend to be much more concerned with equity than equality. It's really important. Children seem to be much more concerned with equity versus equality. So equity is defined as fairness. Equality is defined as equal, right? And so children are much more concerned that things feel fair and less concerned with that things are exactly the same or equal. I'll just give you one more example and then move on. When I think about this, I always think about Christmas at my house when we were growing up. My mom was obsessed with, I guess, equity, but definitely with equality. She made sure every Christmas that my sisters and I all had the exact same number of presents under the tree. So we had the exact same number of things to open. And so even if that meant wrapping up like an empty Kleenex box or, just throwing in a pair of socks in a box, as long as that meant we all had the same number of gifts, then, that was really important to her. I think as we grew up, we certainly can appreciate that, some gifts are just simply more expensive than others. And if I got like a really nice piece of jewelry and my sister just got a couple of t-shirts, I understood. I could understand why she would get 2 gifts and I only got 1. But I still think back to that. My mom always made sure we always had the exact same number of gifts. Okay. Anyway, last factor that we know is really important in terms of what the sibling relationships look like is examining communication and other familiar relationships. So, what does a relationship between if mom and dad, or mom and grandma, or your dad and uncle, or whoever happens to be an important members of your family, what do those types of relationships look like? What is that interaction looking like? Because odds are that is going to influence what your relationship looks like with your siblings, right? So there's 2 kind of explanations for what can happen. The congruence hypothesis suggests that sibling relationships will kind of reflect what other parent-child relationship looks like and what kind of marital interaction looks like. So basically, congruence hypothesis is kind of a matching hypothesis, right? If parents have a really warm, loving relationship, then children are likely to kind of model that, and then siblings may have a more kind of warm and loving relationship. Or if, parents have really contentious relationship full of conflict and tension, then that might also show up within the sibling relationship. On the other hand, another hypothesis is the compensation hypothesis. In this hypothesis, the prediction is that siblings will kind of compensate, right? So if children are not getting what they need from parents, they then will kind of provide it or get it from their siblings. So if mom is never around or unable to ever be present, then siblings may turn to each other more. And so these are both kind of interesting explanations for what how familial relationships might influence the sibling relationship, right? Research findings, I think, kind of more primarily support the congruence hypothesis, right? And this idea of social learning and modeling, but they certainly are both worth thinking about and both important ways to examine the impact of the other family relationships on the sibling relationship. Okay, so I think I'll stop at this point. The next set of slides, as I mentioned, is more about sibling relationships across the lifespan.